Welcome to Clarity, a podcast powered by the Thomson Reuters Institute. I'm Zach Warren, the Institute's Legal Insights and Strategy Lead. In each episode, we dive deep into a single question from decision makers and thought leaders from legal, corporate, tax accounting and audit, and government communities. In today's episode, we discuss the big question: what does it take for law firms to create and prove client value? That word value may be somewhat of a loaded term in the legal industry of 2026. Of course, clients want a good value for their services, looking for lower costs as budgets are getting squeezed. But they're also looking for valuable insights, as the main thing clients want above all else is top-notch legal expertise. So how can law firms provide the value that clients are looking for, and what touchpoints even go into figuring out value anyway? Today's podcast features Jen Dizo, TRI's Director of Client Relations, and Sushmita Parihar, TRI Senior Analyst, who come armed with data about what value should mean to law firms today. Take a listen as they discuss the 3 stages of client-law firm trust, the practical steps law firms should be taking now, and why value is the defining issue of 2026.
Well, hey everyone, and welcome. We're really looking forward to today's conversation. Today we're going to unpack what value actually means in the legal industry and why it's more important and potentially more complicated for both law firms and their clients as we kick off 2026. Now, today I'm joined by my colleague, Sushmita Parihar, one of Thomson Reuters Institute's top analysts. Sushmita has spent the last few months digging deep into how law firms deliver and measure value and what it is that clients are really looking for. I have to say, her research doesn't just show how law firms can create high value for clients, it also gives law firms a way to measure if they're actually meeting these new higher expectations. So Sushmita, welcome. I'm really excited to jump into the conversation with you today.
Hi, Jen. Yes, I think everyone is going to find the research we've done around this topic to be really interesting. Not to give too much away in the first few minutes, but we found that so much of the concept of value goes beyond high level definitions of clients getting more for less. The type of relationship you have with clients is going to dramatically impact how clients perceive the value that law firms deliver. So, unfortunately, there isn't a one size fits all approach. There's far more nuance than that we see in the data.
I cannot wait to get into the details, so let's just jump in and do that. I want to start with the big picture. Obviously, the legal industry is in the middle of some serious transformation. And this is with the context that the last few years have been strong for law firms, right? Demand has been high, rates keep climbing, but now we're starting to see potentially some economic uncertainty. AI is definitely coming in, shaking up how legal work gets done. We've got a number of big mergers that are changing just the landscape of the industry. So I do feel like transformation is the right word to describe the market today. Now, you've gone through thousands of interviews with general counsel that we conduct each year. How does value actually fit in with all of these changes? Why is there urgency around understanding how clients define value and for firms to get it right now?
So, the reason the client context has to come first is because value doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's defined by what the client is trying to accomplish and the realities they're operating within at that moment. Data from our most recent State of the Legal Market report shows that 86% of GCs view their function as a significant contributor to organizational objectives. Yet 90% of legal departments cite resource-based limitations as their biggest constraint in delivering greater value to their organization. What this reveals is that the organizational systems clients exist in haven't adapted to support this evolved role. Essentially, legal departments face what we call a value squeeze, where they're expected to deliver strategic value, to be proactive business partners, to contribute to organizational objectives, but they're doing it with the same limited resources they've always had. And this, in turn, affects how they engage and evaluate external counsel. In our research, we see that when buyers speak about instances where law firms have delivered excellent value, they point to examples where law firms have alleviated the constraints they face. You make their job easier, you free up their capacity to do strategic work. In similar vein, when clients speak about instances when law firms have missed the mark, they point to examples where law firms have amplified their constraints. When you force them to chase you for updates, coordinate between your practice groups, or defend surprising bills to their CFO. In this case, you're not just failing to add value, you're actively destroying it.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And I think what I find most interesting is honestly that last piece you said, because I think many people in the industry will use the term value add, right? And when you use that phrase, perhaps value starts to be seen almost as a nice to have. But what I'm hearing you say is that if you miss some of the key aspects of value delivery, you're actually damaging the client relationship. Now, something that, of course, the people who are listening are not going to know. I do. I have the pleasure of working with you. Your background is steeped in analyzing and understanding organizational behavior. Fascinating topic. And what I found so interesting when going through the latest report was how the type of client relationship that a client perceives it has with a particular law firm, that's actually going to change how clients measure value. So can you talk to us a little bit about that dynamic?
Absolutely. So, our research on client law firm relationships come from the application of the Lewinsky-Bunker model of trust development, which identifies three progressive stages of trust development in professional relationships, and each creates a fundamentally different emotional context for how clients perceive value. Stage one is calculus based trust. This is transactional trust built on cost benefit analysis, the basic, can I rely on you to do what you said you do type of trust. This is where most law firm relationships start. The emotional context here is vigilance and verification. Clients are watching. Did you deliver what you promised, when you promised it, for the price you quoted?
Now I see why you call it calculus-based trust, because essentially it sounds like it's a math equation, right? Price versus outcome. And maybe the outcome is an actual legal outcome. Maybe it's the experience of working with the firm. It was better than the client anticipated. So, yep, check the box. Value's been delivered. And I'm going to admit something because honestly, I've talked about value for years in the industry. And I've essentially used this exact framework as the key measurement of value. You're kind of making me rethink how I want to talk about it, because I think what I'm hearing you say is this is pretty surface level value, almost the base expectation, and maybe not what a client is measuring you in every type of relationship. So what's that next stage past calculus based?
So, stage two is knowledge based trust. This develops through repeated demonstrations of reliability and competence over time. The emotional context shifts from vigilance to confidence. Clients move from prove it to me to I trust your judgment. They understand your patterns, your communication style, your competencies. In these relationships, clients assess your value based on expertise and outcomes, not just inputs. They're focused on what problem did you solve and what risk did you prevent. So, your value conversations need to emphasize prevented problems, strategic insights, and business impact. You're making your expertise visible and connecting it to business outcomes that matter to them.
We're still talking about outcomes, but the needle, so to speak, has moved ever so slightly, I think, to a different way of thinking about value. What you're saying is that as a law firm continually delivers these great outcomes over time, they've basically reset client expectations on what the very definition of value is. So, what was valuable yesterday turns into what is expected, and maybe it's not so special today. So, you've essentially got the law of rising expectations. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
Exactly that.
Yesterday, we were doing a client panel on what makes for best in class relationship management. And one of the managing partners who joined us on this panel really made a point of saying you have to earn the trust of clients before they're willing to move the relationship from that legal provider into that trusted advisor position. And strikes me as that kind of applies here too, right? Like as lawyers, you in fact may be trying to provide some of this proactive advice, this business scanning for the client that you're talking about. But if you haven't actually established that base level, that first tier of trust by delivering consistently great outcomes and a great experience time after time, actually clients may not even be willing or open to some of this more proactive advice because you haven't even cleared that first hurdle. So I do want to make sure that as we go through the conversation, we talk a little bit about where law firms go wrong and why clients may not always agree with how law firms are assessing the value that's been delivered. Because I think you said it was 3. So what is that third stage of trust in client relationships?
So the third and final stage is identification-based trust. This is rare but incredibly powerful. This is built through shared values and aligned goals. When you achieve this level of trust, you're no longer an external vendor. You're an extension of the client's team. The emotional context here is belonging and partnership. The client sees you as one of them. In these relationships, clients assess your value based on partnership and alignment. They're thinking, you're part of our team, and we succeed or fail together. Your value conversations emphasize shared goals and strategic partnership. You're not defending your fees, you're collaborating on strategy.
Now, I'm going to pick on you for a little second here because you've made this sound really linear, right? But I think we both know client relationships are anything but. So I think one key takeaway that I'd want to make a point of calling out is first, it's really important to recognize where each of your different client relationships sits on this spectrum that you've just plotted out for everyone. Because honestly, not every client is going to see you the same way. That's okay. Everyone's at a different stage of development, but understanding those differences is crucial because it's going to impact how you ultimately need to interact with that client. Another piece is back to this idea of relationship complexity. There's so many moving parts, and I have to imagine certain moments are going to matter more than others. So maybe let's start getting a little more tactical. What are some of those key touch points? Where should law firms really focus their energy? Do certain touch points have better opportunities for the firm to get that value equation right?
So, Jen, that complexity that you're referring to is why the first touch point really matters. The starting point is demand management, which is about understanding the business problem, not just the legal question. This is your intake and scoping process, those first conversations before any legal work begins. Here's where most firms fail. Say, for example, a client says, we need help with the merger agreement, and firms immediately jump into legal mode, thinking about indemnification provisions and warranties, but they never ask the fundamental business question. Why are you doing this deal? What business goal is driving it? What does success look like from a business perspective? This matters because, as we know, clients are already stretched thin. If they then have to explain their business context multiple times or to multiple lawyers at your firm, you're consuming their limited capacity on coordination work instead of strategic work.
What you're talking about is this is one of those practical tips that sounds really obvious, but my experience has been it's really easy to overlook in reality. And in fact, the longer that somebody is practicing law, the easier it is to really bypass some of these basics that you're talking about. And I get it because it's like you've done something for 10 or 20 years. You're like, I absolutely know how to help my client navigate this issue. But going back to what we said at the very start, we're in a really different environment today than we were 20 years ago. And some of those old definitions of what clients want to achieve and what's going to be truly valuable to their organization, they may not apply anymore. So I think, one of the things you're kind of, talking about is, how do you make sure that at the very beginning you're aligning on expectations? And this is where things like a formal intake process can be a real game changer. Now, I'm not going to call any firm out by name, but I've worked with a lot of firms. I have seen intake forms that run like 30, 40 pages long, and no lawyer I've ever met, and definitely no client, is going to want to go through all of those questions every time there's a new issue to be addressed. So maybe one of the questions that I would pose back to you is, are there maybe 3 or 4 things that lawyers should be truly considering at the start of this engagement to make sure that they're not getting stuck in that more transactional, here's the legal advice that is going to best suit the problem that you have, and instead maybe start building towards some of those deeper tiers of trust that you were talking about earlier?
The 3 things that lawyers need to think about here are the first being whether you're capturing strategic context upfront. And as you just referred to, it does start with a structured intake. So, not just what's the legal question, but questions like what business goal is driving this? What constraints are you under? Budget, timeliness, regulatory pressure, and how will success be measured beyond simply being legally compliant? And the key question really here is how does this affect the client's revenue, costs, competitive position, or operational efficiency? Because general counsel aren't thinking in terms of legal tasks. They're not thinking we need a merger agreement. They're thinking we need to structure this acquisition in a way that protects our IP, minimizes tax exposure, allows day one integration, and avoids regulatory scrutiny. Those are business outcomes, not legal inputs. And your legal work needs to map to the client's P&L and operations. We saw a great example of this in practice. One client told us their law firm helped create a template letter for changing employee terms that could be used across multiple jurisdictions. That dramatically improved efficiency in the client's internal processes. The law firm understood the real business problem wasn't drafting a letter, it was managing a complex HR process at scale across global operations. They designed the work product for efficiency and reuse. The second thing to consider is whether you're involving business stakeholders early. Don't just talk to the legal team. Bring in procurement for contracts, compliance for regulatory issues, HR for employment matters. The legal department is increasingly trying to act as a strategic business partner to the business. If you speak the language of those teams, you make your client's job easier. You're serving the business, not just the legal department. And the third is whether you're translating scope into business outcomes. So instead of saying, we'll draft the merger agreement, say, we'll structure a transaction that minimizes tax exposure, protects your IP, allows day one integration, and positions you for regulatory approval. That framing matters. It positions you as a business advisor with legal expertise, not just a legal technician. When firms get this wrong, clients notice. One client told us the advice they received was technically excellent but not practical, and that it led to additional fees to fix internal missteps. That's a failure of demand management. Legally perfect analysis that creates more work, more cost, and less value from a business perspective.
Yeah, so your big mic drop is don't make more work for the client and definitely don't create billable work for the client. Uh, Good advice. We should write that down. I think, joking aside, and something that I do want to call out and acknowledge, I'm just going to keep saying it. Like I've done this for over 20 years, so I've seen a lot over that time frame. I can honestly say I've never met a lawyer who sets out to do unnecessary work to pad the bill or have the client do extra work. And in fact, it's usually the exact opposite. The number of blatant and silent write downs that we see lawyers make just so that they're avoiding overcharging clients for doing work that's integral to the matter at the hand, but maybe the lawyer's like, God, I can't really charge for this. I mean, it's a huge number. But most of this happens behind the scenes. Lawyers don't always take the time to explain to clients why they're taking on this certain approach or how it's designed to get the client exactly the outcome that they want. And when that communication is missing, clients will fill in the blanks and look, they're not going to paint the prettiest picture. So I think it's really important to make sure that as you start thinking about value, a lot of this really does come down fundamentally to communication. Okay, so that's kind of the upfront. What are some of the other stages of the client relationship that you see as prime opportunities to deliver that higher value experience?
So, the second stage I'd like to talk us through is service design, which is about how you organize and package your services. The key question to ask yourself here is are your offerings built around client outcomes or your internal structure? Most firms organize around practice groups, M&A, litigation, IP. That makes sense from an expertise development perspective, but from the client's perspective, it creates a nightmare. Without intentional coordination and collaboration, the client can end up managing handoffs between practice groups, attending separate meetings, ensuring alignment, coordinating between all those silos.
Yeah, we hear this all the time, both in our big research that you're referencing, as well as client feedback programs that we do. So, before I let you go into some of the other touch points, do you actually have some best practices here? Like, what can law firms do to tackle some of this collaboration organization?
So, there are two best practices to consider here. First, assign a single relationship manager who coordinates all practice areas. From the client's perspective, there's one point of contact. Behind the scenes, if a matter touches corporate, employment, and IP, that relationship manager pulls together an integrated team. The key is that the client isn't managing those handoffs, the firm is. We saw a great example of this again in the research. One energy sector client explained that on outsourced technology work, the law firm they were working with integrated almost seamlessly with their information services team. The firm became part of the project alongside other contractors, which meant the in house legal team didn't have to duplicate meetings or manage the work day to day. That's service design done right. The firm integrated into the client's workflow instead of forcing the client to adapt to the firm's structure. The second consideration builds on that. Design your services as business solutions with legal components rather than legal advice. So instead of offering employment law advice, offer workforce restructuring support that minimizes legal risks, maintains employee morale, and achieves your cost reduction targets. You're positioning yourself as a business partner, not a legal vendor. Another client example really illustrates this. The law firm engaged by this client created an inventory and a framework for managing new legal rules and regulations. That added real value because it allowed the client to focus on implementation, not interpretation. And over time, that framework became embedded in how the legal department operates. Again, this wasn't just regulatory advice, it was a business solution that made the client's operation more efficient. And when law firms get this wrong, clients notice. One client told us they'd worked with a firm where poor service meant matters were handled without any real consideration of their needs. That's a service design failure, and it has a lasting impact on how the relationship is perceived.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're talking about collaboration from two perspectives. Earlier on, it was more about within the firm and how are you really integrating the relationship. But then you're also talking about collaboration with the client as well. And I'll say, look, I've heard a lot of fancy terms for collaboration, but service design may be the first that I've heard about it. I do want to pose a little bit of a challenge that I do anticipate that potentially folks who are listening to this may be thinking of themselves. You know, we've been striving for better collaboration in this industry since the industry began. The challenge we always end up seeing is when we talk about getting more people involved in a relationship, both from the client side and from the law firm side, you start to get more questions being raised about just the consistency, right? So is the quality going to be the same across different work types, different people that are engaged in the work that we're doing? Will the service experience kind of feel seamless? So I presume the research tackles this in some level. So what really came out around this idea of consistency?
What you're referring to, Jen, is delivery excellence, and this is about execution and quality control systems. Errors and missed deadlines consume clients' time, their budgets, and their workload capacity. One client summed this up perfectly. They told us that when things go wrong, it's rarely about technical skills. It's almost always about communication. Firms don't fully understand their needs or they don't manage their expectations well. And they were very clear. They don't expect perfection, but they do expect to be kept informed. That's the standard firms are being held to. And here's what's really interesting from the research: poor communication loses clients faster than excellent communication wins them.
Okay, stop. I want you to say that one more time, real slow, because my experience is most lawyers put the emphasis almost on the opposite statement.
Yes, it's counterintuitive. Excellence in communication is expected. It doesn't make you stand out, but poor communication is a deal breaker and will lose you new work. You can have brilliant legal minds, but if you're not communicating well, you're putting the relationship at serious risk because communication failures prevent knowledge based trust from ever developing. That's the trust built through repeated demonstrations of reliability and competence. And if you never build that, you'll always be seen as a vendor, never as a partner. And vendors get squeezed on price.
Yeah, so I knew this would ultimately end up being the case, which is communicate, communicate, communicate. And so far, it sounds like just going through the phases, it's aligned with the client expectations on outcomes and make it easy for clients to work with you across different service lines. Don't surprise clients with your approach or changes in scope. Where I see lawyers struggle pretty considerably is more so at the end of an engagement. Now, everything that we talked about before, it's a consistency play, right? So sometimes you have to remind yourself to have those types of conversations, but lawyers are pretty good at it. At the end of an engagement, I find this is where we start to potentially downplay the value that has been delivered. Sometimes that's out of humbleness. Sometimes, and I think you made some really good points earlier, I don't even know how to communicate in the same terms as clients, and you've outlined some of those a little bit earlier around what business outcomes look like. Another big misstep is lawyers will just assume the client already knows the value of the work being delivered, so I don't even have to talk about it. Your analysis suggests that could be potentially way off base. So can you talk a little bit about that phase of the relationship?
So it's worth remembering what clients are dealing with internally. Budgets are tight, and someone has to explain why a firm is worth the spend. When the CFO asks, why are we spending £500,000 on this firm? And if your client can't answer that question clearly in under 2 minutes, they're left managing scrutiny, and that's not adding value. And that's exactly what this next component, value capture, is about. The question to consider here is, can clients clearly see and articulate the value you deliver? Notice I didn't ask, do you deliver value? I asked, can clients see and articulate it? You might be doing brilliant work, saving millions, preventing risks, enabling strategic opportunities. But if your client struggles to explain to their CFO why your premium pricing is justified, there's a gap here. And here's what the research shows: price resistance isn't really about your hourly rate, it's about outcome uncertainty. Clients measure fees against outcomes, not hours. If they clearly see that your 150,000 fee enabled a 50 million acquisition with tax treatments that saved them 8 million over 3 years, the rate isn't an issue. That's obvious ROI. But if all they see is a bill with time entries like research 3 hours, they can't demonstrate what they got for their money.
Yeah, and I'm going to add on to this because I think it will be easy for folks listening to think that you have chosen like a dramatically extreme example of this. But again, I've had this come up so many times in conversations with general counsel when we're doing client feedback programs where this destruction of value really can happen at any size of a matter that a firm has done for a client. And so I had a case that was very similar to the one that you mentioned. The firm had saved a client tens of millions of dollars in fines on any measure, like you're saying. Clear ROI. The lawyer's bill was $200,000, but in comparison to what was saved, it was a no-brainer. Two things happened that really impacted the perception of value delivery, maybe three. First, the amount of time it took for the invoice to actually reach the client after the matter ended was about 6 months. Because so much time has passed, the invoice itself, and it was exactly what you said, like the 3.2 hours research. It's not like the items on the invoice weren't tied to anything. So the CFO, who is not the general counsel, opens the invoice, and the only takeaway that they made was, well, this bill's 3 times higher than what we normally spend with the firm. Now the general counsel was put in the hot seat. They had to defend everything. And look, it's a dramatic case in terms of the dollar amounts that were sitting involved in this, but like the lawyer was able to explain everything. The bill got paid, but to your point, the second you're having to defend the price and the value that you've delivered, yeah, unfortunately, it already is going to put you on the back foot, and some of that value's been eroded. So some of the ways that we've always worked with firms is, telling them sit down at the end of major engagements, review the draft invoice as close to the end of the matter as possible. It's a simple step, but it makes the value more tangible and clear. It prevents surprises. And to your point, it puts the immediate client in the driver's seat of being able to really articulate that value. All right. I think we are absolutely fast approaching our time, but I do want to get back to one thing that we said at the very beginning, because you also did create this self-assessment tool that law firms can use to measure the value that they deliver to clients. Could you pick maybe one or two questions that people should be asking themselves from this assessment?
Yeah, a lot of what we've talked about today actually comes directly from the research behind this self-assessment tool. And if I had to narrow it down to just two questions firms absolutely have to ask themselves when auditing their client experience journeys, the first one would be this: do we truly understand the business problem, not just the legal question?
Yeah, and I think similar to what we said earlier, business outcomes, not did you understand the legal problem, but those business outcomes. So great, I agree. I think that's a perfect one. What about your second recommended question?
The second question is, can clients actually see and explain the value we deliver? Together, those two questions bookend the entire value chain. They're about getting the business context right at the very start and making the impact visible at the end. And if firms struggle with either of them, they're likely leaking value in their client relationship.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's brilliant. I love those two. Sushmina, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I could talk about this for hours. I'm sure the listeners and viewers, because I think we're also video recording this, are going to be walking away with a lot of great information and tips for how to accelerate value delivery. Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Jen. You too.
Thank you to Jen and Sushmina for your insights today. Law firms have always tried to provide value to clients, of course, but as today's podcast noted, being able to ascertain what value clients want is a key skill for law firms to develop in 2026 and beyond. Clients have more ways to get legal work done than ever before, so maintaining those trusted client relationships takes on an all-new importance for today's firms. Thank you as always for joining us for Clarity, powered by the Thomson Reuters Institute. You can follow or subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to share with your colleagues, leave a 5-star review and a positive review on YouTube. For more data-driven analysis of today's professional services market and in-depth conversations with industry thought leaders, please visit us online at thomsonreuters.com/institute and follow us on LinkedIn under the Thomson Reuters Institute. Clarity is a production of Thomson Reuters, copyright Thomson Reuters 2026.